Chinese box. Whoever knows that he knows must be amazed. This is both to wonder and to be lost in a maze to wonder, because knowing and being is downright weird, and to be lost in a maze because knowing that one knows generates a confusion of echoes in which the original sound is lost. For when I know that I know which one is I, the first, which knows the second, which knows that I know, or the third, which knows that I know, that I know. On the one hand, to know about knowing is to think, to have in mind a formula of words or symbols which stands for the act of knowing. On the other hand, it is to turn the senses back upon themselves, to try to become physically aware of the very organs of being aware. Infants do this from the beginning. They probe, suck, and manipulate the accessible parts of their own bodies. They poke their fingers into their ears. They try touching their eyeballs. They whirl themselves around so as to feel dizzy. The only trouble is that the body is not completely accessible to itself, and the senses are not fully transparent to themselves. True, I can explore someone else's body much more fully than my own, but that wasn't quit. What I wanted to do, I wanted to feel it all from the inside rather than the outside, because then the senses are fully transparent to themselves, the act of knowing. And isn't this really what I call I seems to be without any tangible foundation? It springs from the void. It stands alone, a light illumining the world, but not illumining the wires that connect it with the world, since they lie immediately behind it. I am therefore to myself a stranger in the earth, facing and meeting the world, but not really belonging. Herein, quite simply, is the origin of man's poignant sense of individuality, of being uniquely alone, and of having an existence which is mysteriously lost and problematic. He is kicked out of paradise because paradise is having a connection, roots in the garden, stem from the branch current to the light. To be unaware of the connection is to have one's heart in the wrong place, far out in the fruit, instead of within in the tree. It is to feel that one's basic self is isolated within the body's envelope of skin, forgetting that the self is the whole circulating current from which embodiments come and go, season after season, endless variations upon one theme. The Chinese box, 100 gourds from the mind of one vine. Nevertheless, the sensation of being lost and alone is not actually something against nature. It is a dare, an adventure, a new game of getting lost as children sometimes like to be shut up in the dark. To play it being individual alone and afraid to die is a strangely fruitful game. Hence all wonders and myths, religion and philosophy, science and techniques. Hence the whole splendid and terrible fantasy of man's civilization. Hence also the marvelous bitter sweetness of loving another person. Your eye inside your skin, and my teat inside mine, pockets of the same current, but not knowing it save in the obscure form of loving you without being able to say just why. I never die at all. I only get lost every time I am born, because I then come to feel that I am rolling around out there all unconnected. And when I feel out there, I am as unconscious of my connection, of my being. In fact, the whole current, as I am unconscious of the brain formations which underlie consciousness. The question to be explored is how far out can I get? How lost without being utterly lost? It is thus that when we are children, we test the limits of real itity. We try to find out how much we can get away with, how far we can provoke authority without calling down wrath, and how deeply we can get involved in all sorts of games of skill without losing track. The question for the human being is how personal can I become without losing track? How unique how sensitive and sympathetic, how respectful of human life, or for that matter of animal life. How far does my very claim to humanity depend upon protecting my own rights as against those of the collective? Even more important is being a person in the direction of losing track. Or may it be that when the connection is lost, it can be regained only by going forward and becoming personal to the extreme limit? The importance of these questions lies in the fact that Western cultures have bred a type of human being who feels strongly alienated from everything which is not his own consciousness. He is a stranger both to the external world and to his own body, and in this sense he has lost his connection with the surrounding universe. He does not know that the ultimate inside of himself is the same as the ultimate inside of the cosmos, or that, in other words, his sensation of being I is a glimmering intimation of what the universe itself feels like on the inside. He has been taught to regard everything outside human skins as so much witless mechanism which has nothing whatsoever in common with human feelings and values. This style of man must therefore see himself as the ghastly and tragic accident of sensitive and intelligent tissue caught up in the cosmic toils like a mouse in a cotton gin. Yet this isolated experience of identity is far out in the double sense of being very lost and very courageous. It is a heroic identity. But alas, one of the most troublesome kinds of people is the hero without humor, who is in this case the style of individual who is unconscious even of the ghost of a connection. He is acting Hamlet so seriously that the player of Polonius is actually murdered on the stage. On the level of real life, as well as on the level of dramatic performance, there must always remain some hint or clue Ariadne's thread, so connecting the players with reality that they can afford to get lost in their roles. Mastery in the drama consists in so concealing the clue that it almost appears to be gone. So superb is the acting that the audience very nearly forgets that there is a proscenium arch marking off the stage from actual life. Likewise, mastery in nature consists in evolving an individual organism so unique and so autonomous that it almost appears to be a separate universe. Such is human personality at its best. Actually, however well concealed, the clue is always there, for if the connection were, in fact, to dissolve the illusion of the separate individual, would likewise vanish. Westerners are not the only people who feel that they are disconnected individuals out there on their own, but they are the only people who brag about it, and this is because the isolated style of individuality has a highly positive value in their religious and philosophical traditions. Hebrew and Greek attitudes have combined through Christianity to nurture and exaggerate this particular sensation of personal identity. And to this day, both Catholic and Protestant orthodoxies stand powerfully opposed to any viewpoint that seems to compromise the integrity of the individual soul. Any suggestion that there is some inner level at which, as in Hinduism, God and man are identical, at which thou art, that is dubbed pantheism, as if this anathema simply ended. The Nikada then and there. To some extent, this is indeed just as it should be, because a strongly dogmatic and authoritarian abasement of a creature don't you dare to presume that you are God is exactly what has made the Western style of individual so frisky and bumptious. He has had to exert himself mightily to achieve every kind of original novel and practically personal success in order to justify himself before the boss, or the boss notices he loves and judges every single.
Preacher separately and his demands estem. Martin Buber once observed in the Day of Judgment, the Lord will not ask, why were you not like Moses or Elijah? But why were you not like Martin Buber?
In this way, the individual is ever reminded that whereas on the one hand he is unique and immeasurably precious in the eyes of God, on the other he has been conjured into being out of nothingness and down to the utmost core of his existence, is no more than a dependent creature. No arrangement could be more perfectly calculated to produce that particular quality of anxiety, which in the West we believe to be the essential incentive to social and moral endeavor. Yet today, the intelligent Westerner finds himself in an odd situation which requires the deepest reconsideration of who or what a man is. On the one hand, it is less than 100 years since it has seriously dawned upon Europeans and Americans that they are a minority on this planet and that Western civilization is surrounded with peoples who are also civilized, but along rather deherent lines. Hindus and Buddhists in particular do not idealize the separateness of the individual and have never felt that reality is severely divided into the spiritual and the material, the infinite and the finite, the creator and the created. Man has not, in these other cultures, styled himself as an adopted orphan in relation to the divine. On the other hand, man as he is described in the modern sciences has little in common with man as he feels himself subjectively. Subjectively, he remains the isolated consciousness or soul inhabiting a physical body. But to the biological, physical, and psychological sciences, man is a pattern of behavior in a field like a whirlpool in water, and this behavior is ascribable equally to the bodily organism and to its environment. This ecological view of man as an organism environment is as foreign to the Christian view of the embodied soul as it is to the popular materialistic view of man as an intelligent biological fluke in a mindless and mechanical world. Ecology must take the view that where the organism is intelligent, the environment also is intelligent, because the two evolve in complexity together and make up a single unified field of behavior. However, the way in which men feel their existence subjectively is still very largely determined by theological and mythological images. Greek, Hebrew, and Christian images of man lie at the root of our social institutions in our laws and the methods of enforcing them. Our family structures and the raison of children, our status games, our educational and academic procedures, and perhaps most important of all, in the very grammar of our languages. There's someone, the unique and specific ego, who knows and feels, who responsibly causes actions, who dwells in the body but is not quite of the body, who confronts its experiences as something other, who is the inward controller of thinking and willing. This is assumed in every phase of our culture and in all the practical matters of everyday life. It matters not whether any given individual be a Christian or a Jew, a fundamentalist or an atheist, his sense of identity is nonetheless based upon a theological image. Theological images remain immensely powerful even when churches are unattended and Bibles unread. For the sensation of one's identity is not something biological like the response of the eyes to color. It is a result of social conditioning and is itself a social institution. The child comes to feel who he is in response to the words, attitudes, and gestures of others toward him. He is defined by his social environment in the process of learning the rules of the game which his particular society is playing. One in sum, the rules of the social game are based historically upon traditional ideas of cosmology and of the inner meaning of birth and death, fortune and misfortune. For this reason, then, a serious study of theology is still of immense importance in Western culture, but not in the spirit of theological seminaries, and still less in the spirit of mere historical curiosity. What we need is a new kind of theological critique, not a polemic, not a debunking, not even a restatement in contemporary terms. We need a natural history of theology wherein the development of religious ideas and practices is studied not as something good for life or bad for it, but as a form of life itself, like a particular species of flower or bird. At first sight, it may seem that no approach could be more insulting than this to the true believer, for he demands above all to be taken seriously, to know whether we are with him or against him. To such a person, it is subtly but devastatingly irritating to have the discussion moved to an altogether different level, as, for example, to go into the problem of why he personally wants a firm agreement or disagreement with his point of view. This is likewise the familiar psychoanalytic gambit of bugging someone who wants to argue the pros and cons of two football teams by diverting the discussion to the reason for his interest in balls. An Archbishop of Dublin is reported to have said of the Church, "You may persecute us, we are quite used to that. You may argue with us and attack us, we know very well how to handle ourselves. But the one thing we will not tolerate is that you should explain us. However, I have no intention to insult. On the contrary, in the perspective I'm taking, the Christian tradition has appeared to me as something far, far more remarkable than I have hitherto suspected. More remarkable than it can be seen when taken believingly from the standpoint of orthodoxy. The approach I'm trying to follow is so simple that I'm astonished that it has not been used before. And as often happens, an unfamiliar approach is difficult to define. As already intimated, we are going to look at Christianity simply as a phenomenon of life like a rose bush, without asking for the moment whether it be true or false. Thus far, the work is one of observation rather than critique or clarification. But a rose bush grows in a field or garden, and while W.T. the rose bush is doing can be described fully and adequately only if 11 means we'd see it in relation to what other plants are doing, as well as the birds, snails, greenfly, squirrels, and people. Obviously, then, the critique of theology that we need, perhaps we might call it a meta-theology, must include the resources of comparative religion. Since the close of the past century, Christian intelligentsia have woken up to find themselves in a new world, no longer the narrow domain of culture surrounding the Mediterranean Sea, but a world in which Africa, Asia, Australasia, and the Americas are unavoidable neighbors. Too, as the context of a word may change its meaning without altering its form, so also may the context of a culture or a religion. Christianity is one thing in the context of Mediterranean and European culture of Judaism and Islam, but in the context of Taoism and Confucianism, Hinduism and Buddhism, it may be quite another. There is, of course, no satisfactory way of arguing the merits of any one of the great world religions against the others. In all such debates, the judge and the advocate are the same person, for a man judges his own religion the best simply because the standard he uses is that of his own religious upbringing. Almost all apologies for the superiority of one religion over others come down to this tediously circular argument. I have been trying, therefore, to find a more fruitful way of making these comparisons, something that also goes much further than the mere observation that Christians do it this way, whereas Muslims do it that. The whole point of making these comparisons, whether of religions or of cultures, is that the differing traditions should throw light on each other. A Christian should study Buddhism so as to get a deeper comprehension of Christianity. Comparative religion or comparative theology has hitherto been a strictly academic pursuit, and the better authorities on the subject, but competent scholars and subtle philosophers. To date, they have done such an excellent job that no one can make crass or odious comparisons between religions without making it very clear that he is an ignoramus. To say, for example, that whereas Christians believe the ultimate reality to be a loving personal deity, Buddhists maintain that it is only an empty void, is to show that one understands neither Christianity nor Buddhism. For as we go into the depths of these matters, making full allowance for cultural variations, for differences of language and metaphor, and for all the semantic confusions which they engender, it appears that men's experiences of the ultimate are peculiarly alike. When they get down to negative or apophatic theology, the approach to God by the sculptural method of cutting away concepts, St. Dionysius and St. Thomas, are speaking the same language as Nagarjuna and Shankara. At such levels, the differences between sophisticated Christian theologians and Hindu or Buddhist pandits are mere technicalities, but there are other levels. The difficulty with philosophical theology is that it becomes so subtle and so abstract that it neglects the mythic aspect of religion. I am, of course, using the word myth in a special and technical sense, quite different from the vulgar usage wherein myth is falsehood, superstition, or baseless fantasy. The mythic aspect of religion is that which involves imagery or narrative, and secondarily participation in rituals and sacraments. Can one deny that this is by far the most effective aspect of religion, so far as the vast majority of people are concerned? For images are far more moving than abstract concepts, though it is important to remember that even the most attenuated concept is still basically an image. It is arguable, wrote Evelyn Underhill, that every approach of the conditional mind to the absolute God must take place by symbolic means, though these may not be of a material kind and may even be unrecognized by those who use them. With the growth of spirituality, these mediating symbols tend to become more abstract, but this does not mean that they are left behind. The emptiness, the darkness, the nothing, the cloud of unknowing of the mystic, though they be negative statements, are still symbols drawn from his sensible experience in and through which he seeks to actualize his obscure experience of God. The one respect in which Christianity differs quite essentially from other religions is in the mythic aspect, since a Christian is one who commits himself to the idea, though he will say the fact that Jesus Christ was the historical incarnation of God, and that his miraculous birth, his crucifixion, and resurrection were real events which radically changed the relationship of the universe to its creator. To say that these events are mythic is not to deny that they may also be historical. For no Orthodox Christian would want to assert that they are merely historical, like the 14 Battle of Hastings or Mr. Lincoln speaking at Gettysburg. An approach to comparative theology, which is modally enriching in the fullest way, must therefore deal with religions on the mythic level as well as the metaphysical and philosophical. But this does not mean simply the academician's comparative mythology with its stress on the anthropological, archaeological, and literary investigation of myths. The constructive and creative metatheologian must be something much more than a museum curator or accomplished academic drudge. He must be a poet, not just of a sphere, but a master of images, a parabolist, allegorist, analogist, and imaginator. He must be the poet in the primordial sense of the word poiesis, poiein, to make do, to create. Only with this kind of imaginative handling will the myths fructify one another. But things do not fructify one another by mere juxtaposition. They have to be woven together in some kind of active relationship. And for this purpose, I have found the contextual or Chinese box method extraordinarily effective. For example, the Holy Scriptures of the Hebrews are included in those of the Christians, and in this context given an interpretation which the Hebrews find impossible to swallow. Nevertheless, there is nothing positively asserted in the Hebrew religion as a matter of belief about the universe and man, which cannot be included in Christianity. Contrariwise, however, the positive assertions of Christianity cannot be encompassed by Judaism. It is simply not acceptable to the Jew that Jesus was the Lord God in the flesh. Yet Christians have no qualms about reading the Old Testament, as they call it, as a collection of inspired writings which forebode the coming of Christ. The fact that the Christian scriptures can include the Hebrew but not the Hebrew, the Christian does not imply that Christianity is a better or truer religion than Judaism. From the standpoint of an unprejudiced observer, it implies only that if you put the Hebrew revelation within the context of the Christian revelation, the former undergoes a most interesting transformation. Whether or not this transformation will be something more than interesting, that is deeply moving and convincing, will depend upon the reaction of each individual. Now, some of the great Catholic missionaries to India, such as the Jesuit Robert de Noble, have suggested that the Hindu scriptures, notably the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita, should be regarded as a supplementary Old Testament. The notion is laudable, but will it work? Does Hinduism assert anything positively that cannot be included within Christianity? Alas, there is in Hinduism the crucial doctrine of Tat Tivam. Is it that art thou which asserts the ultimate identity of oneself and the Godhead? At the level of philosophical theology, we can probably iron this difference out. We can doubtless argue that the self referred to here is not the ego, not the personal soul, the Hebrew nephesh, but the spirit, the ruach Adonai, or breath of the Lord, which gave life to the clay image of Adam, when it was breathed into its nostrils. We might say that the ground of man's being is the immanent presence of God, which at every moment supports and energizes both soul and body, beyond which is within. As one of the Christian mystics put it, he is thy being, but thou art not his. But this is a subtlety which takes the whole excitement out of the issue. At the mythic level, Hinduism asserts that all experience whatsoever is God's, and that God is the one and only knower and seer. All multiplicity, all sensations of limited and separate individuality, of the duality of here and there, I and thou, are God's dream. Or Maya, a word that signifies not only illusion, but also art and miraculous power. The universe is therefore conceived as God's game, Leela of hide and seek with himself, such that all beings are simply the masks of the one divine self at man. 3. This is an essentially dramatic view of the cosmos, contrasting sharply with the Hebrew and Christian view of the world as an artifact. In the former, the creature is the role or disguise of the Creator, but in the latter, the creature is as distinct from the Creator as the table from the carpenter. But from the Christian standpoint, the former view is quite inadmissible, quite shockingly blasphemous. The Jews felt the same about the divine claims of Jesus. For one of the major values of Christianity, as of all strictly theistic religions, is the eternal importance of differences. Christianity, therefore, insists vehemently on an absolutely essential difference between the Creator and the creature, between good and evil, and between one creature and another. It has often struck me that Christian preachers and apologists like to assume a nubbly or prickly attitude when discussing these matters, coming out in the clipped and crusty tone of their voices. How unpleasant to meet Mr. Eliot, with his features of clerical cut, and his brow so grim, and his mouth so prim, and his conversation so nicely restricted to what precisely, and if, and perhaps, and but, to, and of course, what precisely is very, very important. One really needs to know whether the transparent stuff in the bottle is gin or muriatic acid. Christianity even brings the principle of differentiation into the Godhead itself, with the doctrine of the Trinity, insisting vehemently as ever that the Father is not the Son, and the Son is not the Holy Spirit, but that nonetheless all three are one and the same God. It objects to what it calls the monism of the Hindus, because without differentiation there is no place for the supreme values of love and relationship. However, this argument cuts both ways, because what the Christian says about the three in one and the one in three relationship of the Trinity is almost exactly what the Hindu says about the many in one and one in many arrangement of the universe. If the latter makes love between the members unreal, so does the former. If then the Christian system cannot contain the Hindu, can the Hindu contain the Christian? Hindus are, of course, notoriously tolerant, and it is well known that Sri Ramakrishna lived for some time as a Christian in order to complete his understanding of the many aspects of divine revelation. But wouldn't the Christian say that Sri Ramakrishna could not really have become a Christian without committing himself to the sole and exclusive role of Jesus Christ as the Savior of the world? And wouldn't he also have had to renounce the proud blasphemy of I am that? To understand this, we must go rather more deeply into what was presumably Sri Ramakrishna's attitude, so as to understand the special kind of respect which a Hindu might have for the Christian viewpoint. When the Hindu says that the universe is God's Maya or dream, the word Maya is not necessarily used in a bad sense, as if it were a mere dream. I have said that Maya also means art and miraculous power, the creation of an illusion so fabulous that it takes in its creator. God himself is literally amazed at and in his own work. Were it otherwise, it would certainly be no fun to be God. But amazement means, among other things, getting deliberately lost. And this would naturally involve God's finding himself in a position where he seems not to be God at all, but merely a creature. Getting still further lost, he might well find himself in the most critical of all possible situations, confronted with the ultimate gamble, the necessity of making an immediate choice between everlasting bliss and everlasting torment, without being quite sure how to choose. Will you take what is in the right hand or the left? Choose the right one. Without any disrespect, it must be said that Christianity is preeminently the gambler's religion. In no other religion are the stakes so high and the choice so momentous. Nowhere else is the good so gracious and the evil so blackly malignant from the Hindu's point of view. Then the Christian's predicament is the extreme adventure of God into his own mire. The Hindu must gape at it as we look at trapeze artists and tightrope walkers in the circus, and what can he do but applaud? The ultimate act, the juggler scared out of his own wits, keeping 6 bottles of nitroglycerin whirling from hand to hand. But in this case, the bottles are the stars and galaxies. The first and quite natural reaction of an Orthodox Christian to this point of view is that it deprives the differences between God and man, good and evil, of ultimate reality. If they are no more than a temporary Maya, they are not truly important at all. But that is a most improper thing for a Christian to say, for it is to assert the essential unimportance of whatever is temporal and finite, including, among other things, history. For it is the very center of Christian faith that the world has been redeemed by a temporal and historical event, the crucifixion of Jesus Christ under Pontius Pilate somewhere around 30 AD. This event began and ended in time, and according to the story, culminated in a resurrection from death, which must have been as shockingly splendid as any other awakening from a hideous nightmare. This event is past gone vanished, as surely as if it had been a film of smoke in the air. But will any Christian say that it was for this reason unimportant and unreal? According to the Hindu myth, the Supreme Self is always going in and out of time, so that the Maya is at once temporal and ever returning. For a kalpa, or day of Brahma, lasting 4 J20 years, the world of Maya is manifested. And then for another kalpa comes the night, the pralaya, in which the illusion is withdrawn, and in which the Godhead recollects its own nature free from space-time and finitude. But there, after the illusion begins again, and the days and nights of Brahma continue forever and ever. From the most strictly metaphysical and esoteric point of view, these days and nights must be regarded as simultaneous, as aspects of an eternal present, which is now ever. Rightly understood, a single instant is as long as a century of kalpas, and all time is in just one pulse of comego. We are saying then that differences are no less important for being relative or temporal differences. When one comes to think of it, a permanent or eternal difference would be something as monstrous as an infinitely tall man. To those Christians who affirm the eternal distinction of creator and creature and the everlasting persistence of heaven and hell without rhythm or relief, I actually pause to consider what they are saying. Any scholar of the Bible should realize that its language is often poetic and metaphorical, and to say that the blessed shall rejoice and the damned shall be tormented forever refers not to chronological measure, but to the degree of intensity of an experience. When people said, "Ciro King, live forever," they did not intend it literally, but when the interpretation of the Bible got into the hands of Roman lawyers instead of poets, this kind of thoughtless literalism became dogma. If, however, the Christian imagery is set within the context of the Hindu of the razor-edge path between salvation and damnation, with all the magnificent and palliative consequences that this illusion has had for monkey, one of the greatest dramatic situations of all time. But once this is said, once the show has been given away, hasn't all the magic of Christianity been dispelled? Instead of being a context for the Christian view, wouldn't the Hindu viewpoint simply swallow it up? The answer to that problem must unfold itself through the course of this book. But in the meantime, there is simply this consideration: is anyone absolutely sure that the world is Maya, that he himself is deep down the dreaming Godhead, that death is a change of scene, and that the choice between endless glory and endless horror is just a device for making things thrilling? Isn't it just possible that such ideas as these may be the most insidious hallucina, the most persuasive and corrupting temptations of that arch-fiend and enemy of creation, the devil? No one, not even, I think, the Godhead, is absolutely sure. For to be is courage, and to know is nerve. The answer is always yes, no, because existence itself is a vibratory or wave-like affair. Now you see it now. You don't a back, front, up, down, here, there situation like a mountain or wave with its upside and its downside, clearly different from each other and yet inseparable. To be quite sure, to be set, fixed, and firm, is to miss the point of life. For living and being is a perpetual abandonment of the known and fixed situation. The only true peace is the always slightly uncertain apprehension that no will imply yes just as much as yes implies no. Hence the following is my favorite quotation from Shankara, the saint. Thomas of the Hindus, now a distinct and definite knowledge is possible in respect of everything capable of becoming an object of knowledge. But it is not possible in the case of that which cannot become such an object. That is Brahman, for it is the knower, and the knower can know other things, but cannot make itself the object of its own knowledge, in the same way that fire can burn other things, but cannot burn itself. Neither can it be said that Brahman is able to become an object of knowledge for anything other than itself, since outside itself there is nothing which can possess knowledge. 3, in other words, the root and ground, the firm foundation of the universe has nothing to stand upon, not even itself. It has no knowledge of the how of its own inner workings. This is no defect for the simple reason that this knowledge is not necessary. Light has no need to shine upon itself. But when we, who are used to leaning upon something, first get into touch with this inmost dimension of ourselves, it feels as if nothing is there, as if, in Risbrick's words, our whole life is grounded upon an abyss. There is then a fascinating contrast between the popular and mythic conception of a digestion board. The latter is associated with the potter and the carpenter. He is the supreme technicien who knows just how everything is done, who can explain everything, and who comprehends through and through the mystery of his own being. He knows all the answers. When I was a child and was asking my mother impossible questions about the why and wherefore of life and death, she would often say that there are some things we are just not meant to know, at any rate, for the time being. However, after we had died and gone to heaven, God would make everything clear. So I used to think that on wet afternoons in heaven, everyone would gather around the throne of grace and ask omniscience, why did you do this and how did you do that? And that the Lord would patiently and kindly give completely satisfactory answers. Father, why are the leaves green? Because of the chlorophyll. How? The Hindu God is shown not as a technician, but as a being with many arms and many faces, the cosmic centipede of fantastic dexterity, moving innumerable limbs without, however, having to think about it, to know how it is done. In just the same way we move our own arms and legs, beat our hearts, shape our bones, constellate our nervous systems, and grow our hair with astounding efficiency and yet without need to explain it. Indeed, thinking about these processes often interferes with them, just as the actor or dancer falters when he is too conscious of himself. Therefore, if anyone brought up in a Christian culture says, I am God, we conclude at once that he is insane. But humor him by asking technical questions. How did you create the world in 6 days? Why did you allow the devil to get into the Garden of Eden? What were you doing before you created the universe? But in India, when someone suddenly declares, I am God, they say, congratulations. At last you found out for them the claim to be God does not involve the claim to encyclopedic omniscience and completely arbitrary omnipotence. The RCA's son is that they know very well what a completely omniscient and omnipotent being would do. Imagine a world in which all the ambitions of technology have been fulfilled, where everyone has a panel of push buttons which at the lightest touch will satisfy every desire more swiftly than the jinn of Aladdin's lamp. Less than 5 minutes after this ambition has been attained, it will be essential to include upon the panel a button marked surprise. For Hindus, the world as it is the result of having pushed that button. It is terrifyingly magical at once, far, far out of control, yet at the same time, one's own inmost will. What do we mean in the Western world by knowing how things are done is that we can describe the process in words or some other form of symbolism. It is thus that our education consists almost entirely of learning skill with symbols, reading, writing, and arithmetic, relegating skill in kinesthetic, social, and aesthetic matters to extracurricular activities. But the conduct and regulation of the whole human organism, not to mention the whole universe, is manifestly an affair so swift and so complex that no lumbering string of words can account for it. The omniscience of God is precisely that he does not have to think before he acts. He knows how to produce the universe just as I know how to breathe. In sum, then, I would say that a meta-theology should have at least three basic operating principles. The first is that we look at a religion not as some thing about life, but as a form of life, a way of life, as genuine and authentic as a rose bush or a rhinoceros. For a living religion is not a commentary on existence. It is a kind of existing an involvement, a participation. The second is the Chinese box, or contextual principle, whereby we illumine one theological system, in this case the Christian, by looking at it and see what happens to it in the context of another. This is the same sort of procedure as studying Chinese culture to get a better understanding of the basic institutions of our own culture. For a culture emerged in China that was very highly sophisticated and yet in several respects as unlike our own as anything on earth. It therefore offers the most admirable opportunity for instructive comparison. Christians are characteristically leery of such procedures, but should take comfort from the fact that Hinduism is not a competitive or proselytizing organization like the Roman Catholic or United Presbyterian churches. There is no head office to write to, and therefore no society out to get you and score you as a member. The third, a rather radical departure from the methods of scholarly theologians, is to deal with the subject almost naively at its mythic, imagistic, or anthropomorphic level. I have found that this has many advantages, the most important of which is that it avoids the danger of idolatry. No educated person can take the anthropomorphic image of God quite seriously, and therefore, when he uses it, he knows he is using an image and does not mistake it for the reality. On the other hand, a highly refined abstraction look as if it isn't an image and is thus much more easily confused with a direct description of the truth. We should never forget that all our ideas of the universe, whether theological, metaphysical, or of an anthropomorphic being, translations of the way things are into the terminology of the human brain. Thus, to think of God as necessary being, or as the organic pattern of the universe, can be much closer to idolatry than thinking of him as the old gentleman upon the golden throne, or as the many-armed and many-faced dancer who is playing as the world. Another advantage of this imagery is that it enables us to discuss theological problems in a lively and dramatic way that is intelligible to people at many different levels of intelligence and of many different kinds of intelligence. Hitherto, Christian theologians have, on the whole, been rather ashamed of their imagery. Since Clement and Origen first tried to make Christianity look respectable in the eyes of Greek intellectuals, theologians have bent over backwards to assure us that heaven is not literally up in the sky, that angels don't really go around in white nighties, and that God, the Holy Ghost, is not actually a dove. For by now they have made their point, and thus we can safely return to rich and colorful imageries and to churches and temples, radiant with figures of gods, saints, and angels.